Hello, and welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're going to be talking about common mistakes first-year law students make so you can avoid making these mistakes. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer that you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, Bar Exam Toolbox, the Catapult Careers Conference, and the Trebuchet Legal Careers website. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. If you're a 1L, this episode is for you. We're going to give you the top 5 things law students consistently screw up in their first year, so you can avoid doing any of them.
In a nutshell, here they are. And don't worry, we'll talk about each one in more detail in a few minutes. Number 1, bad time and life management. That's a big one. Number 2, misunderstanding what's expected on the final exam. Number 3, lack of practice. Number 4, lack of feedback or not learning from the feedback that you are able to get. And number 5 is simply not doing the work or not fully committing to the experience. So, how many of these do we see daily with our students? Sadly, they're all very common among 1Ls.
Yes, all of them at any given time, really. So let's start by talking about bad time and life management. It might seem surprising that this is first, but more and more, I think it's absolutely critical. How many students do we see who know what they should be doing, but can't seem to get themselves motivated to execute? Alison, do you see this with the students you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a common problem among 1Ls. I think it's a common problem, frankly, among people. We all know that we should be going to the gym 3 or 4 days a week, and we should be making our healthy dinners. But the reality is, most of us don't have the best time management skills, unfortunately. And a lot of people haven't really been taught these skills. And luckily, they are skills. You can improve. Certainly, you can get better. But this is a sort of situation, and I think a lot of things are like this in law school, where maybe so far the skills that you had in managing your time and managing your life were sufficient to get you through, but they're not necessarily going to be sufficient in the greater pressure of law school. So, for example, if you got through undergrad basically by procrastinating and then cramming for exams, that's a pattern that can cause a lot of problems in law school, right?
Right, because you only typically have one exam. We are starting to see a little more and more professors give a midterm, but oftentimes that midterm really doesn't have a lot of weight in the class. Your grade is still basically based on this end of the semester exam, which means if you push all your work till the end and say, oh, it's fine, I'll just learn all the law at the very end, or I'll just do the practice tests at the very end, that is a huge mistake because you're taking a gamble on your entire semester grades. So procrastination, not kind of seeing the overall picture of what the entire semester really needs to look like, can be very problematic come exam time.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I talk to students who sometimes it's a week before their exams, and it comes out that actually they haven't been doing the reading for a while, and they haven't really been outlining it. They haven't actually done any practice exams. And it's this sort of thing of like, okay, well, you have a serious problem now, and like that you might have been able to do that. I remember cramming for exams in undergrad the day before your exam. You're like, oh, I've got to read, 4 chapters and memorize them. But the reality in law school is like you've got an entire semester of material to deal with, and it's complicated. We'll talk in a minute about sort of understanding what's expected of you, but it's a much more complicated process, and it's just not, particularly with the one final, it's not as easy to sort of leave things until the last minute and then expect that you're going to do okay. Another thing I commonly see is people who either don't have a calendar at all, which is interesting, or they have a calendar, but they're not really blocking out time for critically important activities, things like deep thinking work, the time that you're going to spend outside of class. people sort of focus on just this day to day. When am I in class? When am I going to do my reading? When am I going to work on my legal writing? And certainly all of that's important, but that leaves a really big gap in what you need to be doing.
For sure. And I think one of the reasons why this can be so problematic as well is that you are lulled into a false sense of security because you're working all the time, but you're actually doing the worker bee tasks that are the really the easier tasks to do. You get to check the box. I read the case.
I read the case. I did my reading. I showed up to class.
Exactly. I did my legal writing assignment. I went to this club meeting. I finished this, work assignment, whatever it might be. That's the easy stuff. It's the abstract stuff that makes it so uncomfortable. I studied contracts is a lot harder to quantify. And then, you don't get to necessarily check the box. I would still write on your to-do list study contracts myself. But,
right. Or, as we'll talk about, we can talk about it right now, for example, like what are some ways that students can overcome these type of obstacles and really get control of their time? As anyone who reads my blog, The Girl's Guide to Law School, knows, I'm a huge fan of what we call the circle method. And what this does is it really creates that accountability around I'm going to study contracts, becomes I'm going to study contracts for an hour. And here's the circle that I'm drawing on my piece of paper. And when I do that hour, I get to fill it in. So that actually can help kind of give you that sense of like, oh, yes, I did this abstract thing. And that can really help you stay motivated to continue doing those things that are harder and that you have to be more self-motivated. Particularly, no one's going to be checking to see if you did your contract study time, right?
That's for sure. And I think the other thing you can do, which is how I kind of approached it, was, I would take my calendar and at the beginning of the week, I would block off time for those types of tasks. Because for me, it's much easier to be more disciplined to plan in the future than it is to plan, the day of, right? The best time to do something is tomorrow. It doesn't really, right? So,
right. Well, there's the old story. If you want someone, if you want someone to do something, ask them 6 months in advance. Everyone will commit to that.
Exactly.
So you can use that. Yeah, you can use that to your advantage as a law student by basically pre-committing to the things that you need to be doing that you never seem to find time to, whether it's exercise or, it doesn't have to just be schoolwork. It could be spending time with a significant other so that your life doesn't fall apart. Mm-hmm. Because as we'll talk about in a second, that sort of life drama can be really distracting. For
sure. And, I think being able to kind of schedule out your life and give yourself pockets of time, it just makes it easy. It makes it much more difficult to avoid doing these kind of tasks. You still have to make yourself do it the day of, but you at least know if you're not doing it. Exactly. And I'm a good, rule follower. So it's like, oh, well, if my calendar says I'm supposed to do this today, it's a higher likelihood that it'll get done, which is why Alison and I schedule recording times for these podcasts because if they're on the calendar. We schedule them weeks in advance. Did I feel like doing this morning when I woke up? No. Right. But I was like, you know what? It's on the calendar. We have to do it. And I think that's a good tactic in terms of there's a difference between saying, oh, this weekend I'm going to do some outlining for my contracts class. This weekend is not specific enough. Right. This weekend is Sunday night. You're like, oh, it's the end of the weekend. That didn't really happen. But if it's 2:00 on Sunday for 3 hours, this is on my calendar. At that point, when 2:00 Sunday rolls around, you're like, oh, I need to do this. Yep, exactly. So you need to really think through your time management skills and be practical about it and continue to ask yourself if what you're doing is working for you. If it's not working for you, then it's time to brainstorm some new options. Don't wait until November, late November, Thanksgiving, to realize that you're in trouble and you haven't been doing what you're supposed to be doing. But what about this life management? What about life drama? That can really cause problems for law students. It can cause a lot of serious problems. And the reality is some things are unavoidable. If someone in your close family happens to get sick or you get sick, of some serious disease, there are things that happen. There's nothing you can do about them. You just have to sort of cope with them. But a lot of this stuff, I think, people bring upon themselves. Mm-hmm. So if you're someone who is constantly getting sick in law school, for example, you have to take a step back and think about, well, why is this happening? Am I managing my stress? Am I getting enough sleep? Am I eating well? Am I taking care of myself? Am I taking time off? And we all know, the sort of relationship drama that can happen in law school. It can be very difficult if one person is going to school, the other person in the relationship is not in law school, or God forbid they are. These are things
inevitably, like, everything's going to come to a head like 2 days before your first exam, and you're going to be like moving out of your apartment and you're breaking up this long distance relationship, whatever it is. I mean, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on how people can sort of avoid this, or is it just something you have to cope with?
I think, like you said, you kind of have to separate the stuff out that you can control and you can't control. I mean, life doesn't stop for law school, so there's still going to be life things that happen that you have to deal with. But I think you can decide what drama you're going to invite on your life. So, roommate drama, I've heard about that from a lot of law students. I don't like my roommate. My roommates make it hard for me to study. One of my roommates is a personal trainer and gets up at 5 a.m. and wakes me up every morning. Some of that kind of stuff may be more of a choice.
Yeah. That happened to me. That actually happened to me in grad school, in architecture school. I didn't really realize how horrible the housing market was in Berkeley. So I drove up from LA and I gave myself half a day to find a place to live. Yeah. Yeah. So I ended up living for the first semester in one of the largest co-ops on campus, which had over 100 people, self-managed, like no grown-ups anywhere. It was all a bunch of like 18-year-olds doing a ton of drugs. I didn't say that, but yeah, it was crazy. And so it was a situation where like I had basically created for myself, where I had a roommate in this tiny little room. We had like the worst room in the entire building. We were between like two of the biggest sound systems in the entire building, who would have contests at like 3 a.m. to see whose sound was the loudest. And I'm in architecture school. I'm working all the time. If I'm sleeping, like I need to be sleeping. And it really came to a point where like the last month I basically moved into a friend's house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so don't do that.
Right. And some of that stuff can be avoidable. Really think about who your roommates are. Think about the building you're living in. Are you going to be able to sleep well? Things like that. Especially if you're moving to a new city, it can be kind of daunting to find roommates in a living situation. So you just want to make smart decisions about that and try and remove excess drama. And even if you do have a lot of drama in your life, you can choose to somewhat compartmentalize it. I mean, I have had students who tell me that one of the things that happens when they study is their cell phone's constantly going off. Family members are constantly calling them or texting them about things that are going on. Sometimes you have to turn off your cell phone for a few hours.
Yeah, your cell phone has a do not disturb mode, or it has an airplane mode. And if you're trying to study and people are bothering you, just put it in that mode.
Yep. And if you can't, ignore emails that are coming in, they're distracting, turn off your wireless, shut down your email. You can do these things to protect yourself, to kind of cut down the drama. So I think
it's fair to tell people that too, to basically say, look, these are the hours that I'm going to be in the library every day, so you can't expect to reach me.
Yeah, I've even had students who actually have out of offices on their emails, which may be a little extreme, but they basically will say, I'm in law school and I don't respond to emails between the hours of such and such. Which is
totally fair.
It's totally fair. People do that in the workplace, not lawyers.
It's not like no one's paying for you to talk to them.
Exactly. But, I think you just have to be very honest with yourself. If things make you easily distracted, the internet is just such a big thing for me, and the fact of how many times we check our emails constantly when we're doing something. And sometimes when I really need to get something done, I will turn off my wireless and make myself really focus, or turn my computer into the do not disturb mode where you can't see anything else. And without noticing, I still go click on things to try and check email. And I've shut off my wireless.
It's so habitual.
Yeah, it's
we
crazy.
Don't even notice. And this is one of the things, we'll post a link to the Circles article, but I think that's one of the beauties of that sort of method, is it forces you to single task. And, for 45 minutes to an hour, you are working on one thing. And if you take a break to check your email, oops, too bad. You don't get to count that time. So it actually can train you to sort of be able to focus in at least 45-minute to an hour increments, which is enough to get a lot of work done.
And it is a skill you need to have when the billable hour gets introduced, if you decide to practice that type of law, because every time you check email, you don't get to count that either.
Yeah, exactly. So these are skills that are life skills, not just law school skills. All right, well, let's move on. So up next, we've got basically number 2, misunderstanding what's expected on the final. And this is also a really big one, because I think it can feed into this time management problem, because people spend time doing the wrong things. And partly this is because what you do in class in law school isn't actually that closely related to what you're going to be asked to do on the final. So in class, typically you discuss cases, right? And you discuss them one at a time. And this can lead to a misperception that your law school exam is about knowing the cases in great detail and being able to recall them on command. But this isn't really right. The point of the case is actually just to give you a legal concept. And that legal concept is actually part of a much bigger legal framework. And you have to build up that framework from the pieces. And you have to shape it into something you can use and apply to new problems. So the goal in the exam is actually to apply the framework, which you've abstracted from all these concepts and all the cases that you read. But you have to apply the framework to a completely new scenario. And the scenario is similar to, but not exactly the same as, a scenario you might have seen before in a case. So the point here is, if you spend all of your time rereading cases and trying to memorize every detail, you've kind of missed the point, and you're going to pay for it on the final. Lee, do you see this happening a lot?
I see this happening all the time because, as Alison was talking about, in undergrad, you cram for an exam and you memorize what's included in the chapters. And I think so often people go to law school and they think, well, if I do all the work throughout the semester, I'm good to go. And
yeah, I'm set. Like, what else would you do?
Right. I can tell you what this rule is. Like, I'm good to go. But I think, and to be honest, I was just thinking about it. I don't actually know if I'd read a law school exam question at the beginning of my 1L year. I don't actually know if I had fully appreciated what was going to be the end result.
No, and I think that's something people ought to do.
Had you?
No, I think midway through the semester, I think it occurred to me that I should probably figure out what they want me to do on the final.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth doing, from day one is literally, typically speaking, they're going to be old exams from your professor on a hard drive somewhere or probably in the cloud that you can download. And even though you're not going to understand exactly what the answer is, I think it's highly valuable to at least read them. To read one or two for each class, just to sort of get a sense of what are they going to ask me to do? Because I think it's probably not really what people expect.
I think that's true. And you kind of have to get comfortable with this idea that the law school exam, we call them hypotheticals, is, this kind of quote unquote real world scenario, because it usually has a ton of crazy stuff happen in it that would never happen in the real world. But you're supposed to then take all your knowledge and apply it to this situation. Whereas, in undergrad, you were probably going to summarize what you learned in class. And that's just two totally different things. So just understanding what the output is going to be at the end of the semester, I think, is going to make it easier for you to study throughout the entire semester. And, you have to really realize that you have to know some of this stuff cold. You need to know, especially if your exams are going to be closed book. So my law school exams were all closed book first year. I know Alison's were mostly open book, but I had to have a lot of law memorized. And I'll be honest, come Thanksgiving, I had not memorized enough law. And I was very lucky that my mother called me out on it. Who is a lawyer. Yes. And over the Thanksgiving, dinner table is asking me questions about my torts exam. And I said, oh, I know that rule. And she's like, no, what is the rule? And I said, well, it's like this and kind of this. And she goes, not going to cut it. You have to be able to write it down exactly as you would write it down on the test. And I don't know why that hadn't dawned on me before, but it was a wake-up call that I had a lot of memorizing to do very quickly. And to be honest, my first semester grades weren't as good as they could have been because I delayed that work too late.
Yeah, and I think you see this even how students often their first year will make their outline. The outlines that we see sometimes are not organized in terms of what the law is. They're organized by case. And there are these sort of little mini briefs about this case was about a dog that ran into the street and then it got hit by a car and then the car did, and we're like, what does this have to do with anything? But that's what you spend your time on in class. So I think it's easy to see why people get confused. But the point is that there's one piece of information that's really critical from that case that you read. And it might be something like, I don't even know. I can't think of a good torts example, but something about who's liable for this in this specific scenario. And that's what you're really looking for. And I think this all relates to time management because it's common for 1Ls not to know what they should be spending time on because they don't really understand what they'll be tested on or to spend time on the wrong things. So for example, sometimes it's not uncommon for law students to reread a case and sometimes 3 or 4 times. Let me just tell you, if you're spending time reading a case 4 times, that is crazy. That is not productive. And so, maybe if it's a really important case and you're really confused, you can look back over it for a second time, maybe, but you shouldn't be rereading it 3 times before class and certainly not after that.
For sure. I think the same thing happens with supplements, which at a later podcast we'll dive into, whether supplements are helpful. They are helpful when used correctly. But I've also had students say, well, I've read 4 different supplements on contracts, and it's like, that is probably not the best use of your time.
Right. So, before I go to class, I read 3 different supplements. It's like, okay, that is a complete waste of time.
Right. Exactly. So, understanding what the end goal is, what are you going to have to do in December to get a good grade in your class, and then developing your study plan to get to that goal, and then asking for help along the way. And the way you ask for help along the way is by doing practice. So speaking of practice. Yes, practice. So let's talk about that. We are broken records about practice. So Alison, why is practice so important in law school?
Well, I think for a variety of reasons. I have a friend who works at Georgetown Law School, and she says she likes to talk to the students who did the best first semester, grades-wise, and she says, just come by, chat with me. I'm curious to see what you did. And she says literally to a person, every single one of them says, I took every practice exam I could get my hands on. And there are a couple of reasons this is so important. One is the only way to know what you don't understand is to have it pointed out to you in a practice test. Because obviously you think you understand the material, but when you get an exam and you realize you've missed half of the issues because you didn't actually understand the doctrine, that tends to stick with you. Mm-hmm. So if you see the same set of issues on a final exam, instead of just being like, oh, I don't know, I've never seen this before, you're going to have that moment of clarity. And this happened to me in my torts exam. I took a practice exam the day before the exam. I love torts. I was like totally ready to go. I was like, everything is awesome. And then I looked at the model answer and I had missed an issue. And I was totally devastated. I was like, I'm going to fail this test. Like, this is horrible. I'm like, but that issue showed up on the final. And do you think I missed it on the final? No, I did not miss it on the final. So, I think that's one of the key things is that once you've missed it once, you're not going to miss it again.
And I think it can be hard because practice is one of the things that law students procrastinate on the most. And it really comes back to this idea that it makes us uncomfortable because we are not going to be great at taking law school exams when we're brand new law students. That shouldn't be that surprising to you, that there's going to be a learning curve. You want that learning curve to happen during the semester, not at exam time. That is not the best time for that learning curve. But you have to be, going back to one of our earlier podcasts, in the right mindset that you can take on this challenge and really, throw yourself out there, possibly, make yourself feel like you don't know what you're doing because that's where the real learning happens. So this ability to challenge yourself, make yourself uncomfortable to do this practice is incredibly important, and it should not be left to the end of the semester. You should practice as soon as possible using everything that you can get your hands on. So whether it's...
Right. So, what are some of those things? People sometimes say, well, I'm going to start practice exams the first week. I've got all these old exams from my professor. Do you think that's a good idea? And I'm like, yeah, not so much.
No, because you don't have enough knowledge for that. But professors, I think, generally speaking, are getting better at giving out some small hypos or fact patterns as part of class discussion. Sometimes they'll even hand them out on paper, or if they're using slides, they might be up on a slide. And those little hypos are great things to do early on in the semester because they're likely going to be on a single legal issue. And they're written by the person who's going to write your final exam. There is no better example of what your exam might be like than another example written by that professor. So putting off a lot of those full practice exams, which are going to be incredibly overwhelming to you until you know more law, but using other things that your professor is circulating to help get you that practice. There are also supplements, which will have practice questions in them. Examples and explanations is one of our favorites. 1L year bar questions can be really helpful. The bar all over the country tests mostly 1L subjects. And so you can use bar questions to help you do some practice. They also have multiple choice practice, which some professors are starting to use more and more multiple choice. And they don't release a lot of multiple choice questions. So using bar questions for that can also be really helpful. And then my personal favorite, which people really hate to do, is to make up their own hypos. Because when it goes, I know, and sometimes it's
so evil, Lee.
So evil. So when I taught at a law school and I taught a class for folks who were struggling academically, one of my big assignments was they had to write their own hypos and their own multiple choice questions. And people really pushed back on this. But it's kind of this idea that if you can understand the law to the level that you can write a hypo question that somebody else could take, then you really understand the law, even more than just reading somebody else's question. And sometimes, in a study group, people each write their own and then they swap them, and now you have 5 practice questions to work on. So again, makes people uncomfortable, but it can be a great use of your time and a great learning exercise.
Right. Just think of the difference between reading a book and writing a book. Like, sure, you can learn a lot by reading a book, but if you're able to write a book on a topic, like, you really understand it.
Yep.
And let's move on to this point and talk about feedback, because practice is really important, but it's not the only thing, right? I mean, you also need to get feedback and take it to heart.
For sure.
And as you said, I mean, unfortunately in law school classes, this isn't really that easy because you're only going to have one exam at the end of the semester. But luckily, at least some schools and some professors are starting to provide more feedback opportunities during the semester. And we would definitely encourage you to take advantage of those. I mean, sometimes students kind of dial it in if it's like, oh, you have to write up a hypo answer, but it's not going to be graded. I think that's a terrible strategy. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a great opportunity to get some practice and hopefully to get some feedback. And even if your professor doesn't necessarily give you individual comments on your hypo, it's totally fair to take it to office hours and say, hey, I found this to be a really useful exercise. I had a couple of questions. Like, are there some things I could talk about? Do you have any tips? Because again, this person is the one who's grading your exam. So the more you can extract what they're looking for and what they like and how they like things organized, I think the better that you're going to do. I mean, what are some other opportunities people can take advantage of?
Oftentimes schools have academic support offices, which they are professors or possibly graduates who are basically on campus just to help people academically. So you can investigate what that program's like at your school and whether or not you could meet with those professors to get additional feedback. There are also teaching assistant programs. Alison and I were both teaching assistants, and we would give students feedback on things. And, if all else fails, there are people outside of your law school, such as law school tutors, which is what we do. But I would be wary of getting a lot of feedback from other law students that aren't necessarily
why
TAs.
Is that?
Oh, my goodness. Well, first of all, 1Ls don't really know anything else any more than you do, right? I mean, so you don't want to take another 1L's feedback to heart and say, I'm going to change everything because of this person's thoughts on my essay, because they don't know anything else. I mean, they are not experts in the field.
Right. I mean, certainly a study group can be useful, as we talked about, if you want to write questions and trade them or go over, take the same hypo, each go over your answers, see what you came up with. But you have to keep in mind that this person, it's like the blind leading the blind. I mean, maybe somebody got that issue that you didn't see, or maybe they're totally off base. Who knows?
Exactly. And going to your professors for feedback, I can't tell you how many times I have pushed students to go early in the semester to get feedback from professors, even incredibly intimidating professors that they think are mean or unapproachable. And the professors are very helpful and very kind in office hours because, one, most professors like it when students come to office hours, and they especially are impressed when you've done outside work and you're not just coming in to say, oh, I don't understand the difference between assault and battery, or I don't understand, this case. But if you can say, I struggled with this, or I've been struggling to outline it, here's the work I've done. Could you let me know how I could be better at it? Then a professor is going to be like, hey, this person's put in the time, I'm going to put in the time to help them. And students get incredible nuggets that relate to the exams by going to these office hours. And when I have had my own office hours, when students came in and just threw an outline on the table and were like, I don't understand it, I was not super helpful.
No, you want to see that the person's really made an effort. And I mean, that's also a great way to build relationships with your professors, which can really come in handy later if you're thinking there's any possibility of applying for a clerkship, for example. Mm-hmm. The person who started coming to their office hours the first month of school and did that consistently for the entire semester, was clearly working hard, was a nice person, was struggling with the material, did, in some cases, I had friends who actually didn't do that well in the final, and they still got glowing letters of recommendation because the professors really, they knew that they'd been working, and they just, they took the exam as what it was. It was a bad day.
Mm-hmm. And, these folks are your mentors, I mean, you want to make friends with law professors. You may not, find kindred spirits in all of them, but you're likely going to find a few that you really do connect with, and it's going to enrich your law school experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the last thing that we see one else do, and this is just so sad when we see this happen, but it happens all the time, is just not doing the work and not committing to the experience. So it's so common for one else, as Alison was mentioning earlier, to just not do the work, not do the reading, not do the briefing, not do the outlining, not do the practice exams. And sometimes they even lie about what they're doing. They sit in the library and watch TV on their laptop instead of studying, which I've totally seen. But it is just not the way to find success, and you are just leading yourself down a road of disappointment.
Right. I mean, it's just straight up self-sabotage. And, this ties right back into our episode on mindset that you should listen to if you haven't listened to it. But, the attitude is basically like, this has gotten really hard, so I must not be smart enough. I'll just kind of give up. And you may not have the thought of like, I'll just give up. But suddenly, you find yourself unable to get out of bed, or watching Netflix in the library, or spending 3 hours on Facebook and not doing your reading. And this can start gradually until suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, I haven't done my reading for a week or two. And then it's like, oh, it's too late to catch up. Mm-hmm. What do I do now? And like you're in a pretty bad spot at that point.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've heard students just confess to me that they haven't studied for a week and they've just been watching a Dexter marathon on Netflix.
Yeah. I mean, if you find yourself in this scenario, it's really critical to examine your time and life management practices because, presumably you're probably some combination of burned out, overly stressed out, overly tired, potentially depressed or anxious, or just generally unmotivated. Mm-hmm. And so in some cases, people are unmotivated because they don't actually want to be in law school. But in some, and that's a very valid thing to realize is like, I'm not doing this work because I don't want to do it.
Right.
This is not what I want to be doing.
Right.
And that's something you're going to have to sit with for a while and figure out what to do about it. But sometimes, there are these other things about like you're not sleeping enough, or you're, not getting any exercise, you're not eating well, you're too stressed out, and you're just generally overwhelmed. And a lot of that ties back, and this is why this is our number one, don't do is bad time management practices. Mm-hmm.
And I think the last thing to say on that is that a lot of people don't realize that if you're really struggling, like really, really struggling, just remember your school has resources. Most law schools offer free therapy to law students. We're not even kidding about this. And
no, I did it. Yeah. I was, clinically depressed at the beginning of my second semester in New York City. It was like the coldest winter on record. I was literally not getting out of bed. I wasn't going to class. I wasn't doing my reading. And after a couple of weeks, I was like, maybe I should go talk to someone about this.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. The only thing that's wrong with that is if you don't reach out for help. So if you're...
it was the best, like one of my best decisions ever.
Exactly. So if you find yourself in a position where things really feel like they're not going well, reach out for help. That is going to be the best decision you're going to make.
Right. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is like everyone who's in law school has been smart and successful so far, but you're also going to have to work hard. And everyone has to work hard. So basically you're with a lot of smart, motivated people. And at least some of those people are also willing to work really, really hard. So, you just got to kind of get realistic about the level of competition that you're dealing with.
Yeah. And, just do your best. I think when it all comes down to it, keep a good open mindset, a growth mindset, keep plugging away at it. And if you consistently work throughout the semester and do some of the things that we've talked about, you're setting yourself up for a lot of success.
Yeah, and so let's just run through a quick list of things that we personally recommend to sort of set yourself up for success in law school. We think you should read the cases, go to class, and actively participate. This is your time to sort of figure out what your professor's thinking, how they think about the law, and to practice. And everyone's going to say things that, you feel bad about later in class, or you feel like we're stupid. Try not to worry about it. Easier said than done. But this is your time to really dig deep and make the mistakes. And then you want to make sense of each individual concept you read about. So, what does it mean to, what is assault? What is battery? And then you've got to build these into the framework of the law that you can apply. So it's not just that you know what battery is or assault is, but can you actually use that? Can you figure out, can you practice applying your framework? So you say, okay, the elements of assault are X, Y, and Z. This is a new scenario. I'm going to apply these elements to that. And then you get your feedback, wherever that comes from, and really take it to heart. And then we typically suggest that you actually rewrite your answers, particularly in the beginning, using that feedback. And as an aside, if you happen to struggle with test anxiety, which is a very common situation in law school and typically gets worse, or with other learning issues. You've been diagnosed with some sort of learning disability, that sort of thing. This is something that we really encourage you to deal with early on in the semester. And if you need accommodations, do not hesitate to ask for them. What often happens is people wait until they get their first grades back, and that's when they realize there's really a problem. The problem at that point is you've dug yourself a hole, and you've got to dig yourself out of that hole. It's much better to say, you know what, I know that I have HDDD, I've been diagnosed, whatever it is, and I need accommodations. I need to take a test in a quiet room, for example. These are things to work on early in the semester. And if you can be proactive, you're going to be happier and more successful in law school and beyond. So if you feel yourself in a spiral of depression or anxiety or drinking too much, be proactive and deal with that straight up. You're going to be better off. Unfortunately, Lee, do you have anything else to add? Because I think we're about out of time.
No, I think we're out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave us a review and a rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at Lee, Lee, at lawschooltoolbox.com or Alison, Alison, at lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always reach us via the website, contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon. Good luck with your start of law school.